Tonight on Nova, Hurricane Andrew as seen from a hotel room in Homestead, Florida. It caused unprecedented devastation, but the worst storm ever recorded in the Atlantic was Hurricane Gilbert.
The Hurricane Center cannot believe that we were getting such a strong pressure in the eye, but we believe it.
Journey into the eye of the storm as scientists try to better understand the killing power of the hurricane.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership.
And by Merck, dedicated to pharmaceutical research, committed to discovery, improving health, extending life. Merck.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
With Hurricane Andrew bearing down, most people are hurrying to leave South Florida as fast as they can. But Emmett Williams, hurricane hunter and amateur photographer, is rushing to get as close as possible to record what will become one of the most devastating storms ever to hit the continental United States.
Nothing was safe in Homestead that night.
He and a companion weathered the storm in a hotel chosen for its concrete construction.
All we could see was the flashes from the fuses blowing on the transformer poles.
Wow. This is serious.
The storm rages for 5 hours with winds gusting over 175 miles per hour.
Even though I had been through many hurricanes in the past, I was becoming quite concerned.
They are forced finally into the bathroom.
It's the only room we have left in our room. The rest of our room is now gone.
Even here, the storm's fury is evident.
The pressure's so great that the toilet has been sucked absolutely dry. Wow, drop a piece of toilet paper in there again. Watch what happens to this toilet paper going in the toilet. It gets sucked down. Wow.
2 hours later, they venture outside and begin to witness the damage wrought by Hurricane Andrew. There are billions of dollars worth of property damage, but relatively little loss of life. This was not always the case with the hurricanes of the past.
20 years later, I still ask the same question, why? Why didn't we die? Why did we live? And the only thing I can say is that the good Lord up above wanted us to live so that we could tell people, you know, if anything can be said about a storm or about a hurricane is, you know, when a hurricane comes and when a storm comes, get the hell out.
August 1969, Hurricane Camille. Few survivors will ever forget the deadly terror this storm unleashed on the Mississippi coast.
We were inside the house. We had to swim to the windows across the front of the house, which had already blown out from the pressure and the wind and everything. And we climbed up alongside the chimney onto the roof and floated in the backyard. Well, that's where we stayed for the rest of the night, getting pelted by parts of other houses, tree limbs, and just getting beaten by the rain that was so heavy.
The Mississippi coast lay in ruins, wrecked by a 25-foot dome of seawater, the storm surge. But Camille wasn't the worst. Galveston, Texas, the year 1900. A hurricane flattened the city, killing 6,000. It was the most devastating natural disaster in United States history. Across the world in 1970, a massive storm swept into the Bay of Bengal, drowning 500,000 people. It was one of the worst natural disasters anywhere. But seen from space, these storms, called hurricanes in the Atlantic and typhoons or tropical cyclones in Asia, appear deceptively serene. Made up of clouds and rain circling a clear center, the eye, the hurricane is a gigantic spiral up to 1,000 miles wide. Summer is hurricane season, peaking in September. It's Labor Day weekend, 1988. Thousands crowd beaches and resorts along the Gulf of Mexico. But a potentially deadly threat is moving toward them. Still far out at sea is a storm that will become known as Hurricane Gilbert. Where will Gilbert go? How bad will it be?
Any kind of malfunction prior to rotate, I'll reject and I'll abort it. Anything after rotate, I'll fly the plane straight ahead.
Golf 43, cleared for takeoff.
Even now, an airplane is about to leave Miami for a reconnaissance flight directly into the eye of the storm. Flown by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, this specially equipped aircraft is designed to help scientists understand hurricanes and better predict their often erratic path. For the next 10 hours, researchers will monitor an array of advanced radar and sophisticated sensors. They'll crisscross the storm, reading its vital signs and relaying them back to forecasters on the ground.
But the surface winds look like they're about 70 knots now. And flight level, we're only 60, so we're above the most of the storm, looks like.
Let me see what the smart has to say.
Okay.
Forecasting depends on understanding, and lead scientist Hugh Willoughby uses these same measurements in his effort to figure out the dynamics of the storm and its environment.
The sea surface is looking pretty boily a moment ago. Can't see anything right now.
The biggest mystery is how does the hurricane interact with its surroundings? With the surroundings in the atmosphere. That controls the motion. In a big way, it controls the intensity. I think that that's a solvable problem.
So far, hurricanes have proven notoriously unpredictable.
We figure that the beginning of the hurricane conditions will start there anytime after dark this evening.
And no one knows that better than forecasters at the National Hurricane Center in Miami. Information about Hurricane Gilbert is now pouring in from advanced weather satellites, remote weather stations, and reconnaissance aircraft.
See if we can get a hold of Mexico and see if, because we're talking about 36 hours.
It's up to scientists like the center's director, Bob Sheets, using their knowledge of hurricanes and a variety of computer models to forecast what the storm will do and who will be affected.
Let's say, when you talk to them, say that it could be there within 24 hours to see whether they were prepared.
They said that at least at 6 o'clock they don't want to scare these people because it's moving too far south.
Yeah, right, great. You got 30 seconds.
Sheets finds himself in a role most scientists never experience. Surrounded by a swarm of electronic media, he'll have to communicate his findings almost immediately to an anxious public.
During the tropical depression phase, the tropical storm phase, you get heavy rains, gusty winds.
It could intensify further.
That's right. It's a large system. It's developed its own environment, and so it just generates and feeds on itself.
As the hurricane nears land, the stakes begin to rise.
When you're dealing with the hurricane problem, there are more things involved than forecasting per se. If we put up a forecast, and say we put out a forecast and indicate the forecast of hurricane on the coast in 48 hours, we are creating a mechanism that starts turning, a wheel that starts turning, that's a multi-million-dollar problem. We can't just forecast exactly what we feel is going to happen.
24 hours before predicted landfall, the Hurricane Center issues a warning.
We're going to violate a rule one way or the other in terms of strictly interpreting the manual. I think it'd be better to not put up the watch and just forecast the parameters.
Local officials will usually call for an evacuation, advising residents to board up their homes and businesses to close down. The cost? $50 million for every 300 miles of coastline.
Well, we've seen Hurricane Camille in 1969. We've seen Hurricane Allen in 1980 that were similar to this one. Allen
Despite
was,
the economic trade-offs and the inevitable false alarms, the National Hurricane Center's effort to coordinate hurricane prediction and preparedness has paid off. The number of hurricane deaths is steadily declining. The first hurricane warning system was set up in 1898, a fleet of ships stationed off the American coast. But for decades, meteorologists had no way to track storms far out at sea. During World War II, American ships in the Pacific were caught unaware and battered by typhoons. 1944 saw the beginning of a whole new era in hurricane tracking. Using a powerful new tool, radar, military crews began flying into hurricanes to determine their strength and direction. While better tracking could save lives, it could not protect vulnerable coastlines from spiraling property damage. In the early 1960s, scientists believed they had an answer.
If only the force of the hurricane's winds could be reduced, the toll in death and damage could be greatly lessened. Is there a way?
The way was Project Storm Fury, an active assault on the hurricane. A fleet of planes would drop silver iodide into hurricane clouds. Ice crystals would form, disrupting the storm's delicate heat balance and sapping its strength. But after 20 years, Storm Fury never produced conclusive results. The project was doomed by heavy restrictions on seeding hurricanes too close to land and by doubts about its scientific assumptions. Today, scientists have turned again to tracking hurricanes and improving the accuracy of their forecasts. Advanced satellites allow them to monitor the entire life cycle of a hurricane. But they still lack what they need most: detailed information about the vast tropical environment in which the hurricane forms.
Many people believe that when we launched satellites, we solved the problem of understanding the state of the atmosphere. But unfortunately, a satellite is, for the most part, just a pretty picture. Sometimes they're very pretty pictures. They tell us there's a hurricane there. What they don't tell us, or they don't tell us very well, are what we really need to know about the environment of the hurricane. For example, the flow of air. It's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to deduce from a satellite picture or a sequence of satellite pictures even what the flow of air is. And without knowing that, we can't possibly say where the hurricane is going to go. That is the main limitation in forecasting hurricane tracks.
Most Atlantic hurricanes are pushed west in the flow of air spiraling around a high-pressure zone just north of the tropics, the Bermuda High. But once they head north, hurricanes often fall under the influence of weather systems over the continental United States, becoming highly unpredictable. August 1985. Space shuttle astronauts watched as lightning flashed along the edge of Hurricane Elena. On the ground, Elena was giving forecasters fits with one of the most bizarre tracks in memory. The storm headed straight for Mississippi, and the coast was evacuated. Then Elena slowed down, turned east, and hovered for days just off Florida. After the crowds returned to the Mississippi coast, Elena suddenly looped back, and the beaches were evacuated again just before it hit land. A weather system called a trough, shown in red, had blocked Elena's path and sent it east. Then a high-pressure zone pushed it back to Mississippi when the trough moved by. A few weeks later, Hurricane Gloria formed in the Atlantic and turned north. Its final target could have been anywhere between Florida and Maine. It grazed the coastline, eventually hitting New England.
Okay, the hurricane is not like a block of wood floating in the water that the fluid that the environment is. It's more like a water balloon floating in, or like a wad of jello floating in the river of wind, if you want to look at it that way. If you push it in one direction, it's not necessarily going to go like if you push a piece of wood. If you push it in a certain direction, it may spread out or decide to wiggle off to some other direction. So it's the interaction of the environment again. It's two fluids. It's not a solid entity embedded in a fluid. It's two fluids interacting together. And it's this interaction is very subtle. And the whole concept of this interaction requires some of our most sophisticated computer models just to understand.
We are improving forecasts today. It's been a very slow process. It's been about 0.5% improvement every year in a 24-hour forecast. I fully expect that we're going to increase that, at least double that, at least 1% per year over the next 5 to 10 years. And unfortunately, though, our populations are growing faster than our ability to improve our forecast. Along our coastlines, our populations are growing faster, which means we have to provide longer lead time forecast, and that offsets what we're doing in terms of the improvement of the forecast.
Although the probability of a worst-case event in any one location in any one year is actually very small, it's almost inevitable one day someplace where a storm increases intensity unexpectedly, and we haven't evacuated a large enough area, or a storm changes track or increases its forward speed and we didn't begin to leave early enough. In that kind of scenario, you could have thousands of people die in any number of places around the coastline right now.
When to stay and when to leave is the critical choice in any storm. The Mississippi coast looks peaceful, but residents here have often faced that decision.
Hurricane Bob of 1985 was nothing more than a nuisance storm except for the marine interest. Then in 1965, Hurricane Betsy gave us about a 10-foot tide. It was pretty serious. Our record storm up until 69 was the 1947 storm, about a 14.8-foot tide. And then finally, Hurricane Camille here at Gulfport Harbor was 20.1 feet above normal.
Soon after entering the Gulf of Mexico, Camille began to intensify. On August 17, 1969, at 10:30 in the morning, forecasters predicted that Hurricane Camille would hit Mississippi that evening. 200,000 people had only a few hours to flee.
At 4 o'clock that afternoon, I left the EOC for a few minutes to run down to past Christian Isles and make sure that that area had been cleared out. There were still 3 families down there, but they were packing up to leave. Coming back, I noticed some activity around the Richelieu apartments and pulled up and talked with what I think was the manager. And she said, oh, we're not going to leave. Those that have left have already gone. Some of us are going to stay here and have a hurricane party. I said, well, my goodness, lady, this is a very dangerous area. You need to get out of here. Please pack up and leave. We did not have the authority for forcible evacuation then. We do now. She said, oh, don't worry about us. If the water comes up, we'll go up to the 3rd floor. I said, well, lady, what are you going to do if the bottom floor goes? The 3rd floor is going to come down with it. And that's exactly what happened.
Well, I got off from work early and came home. And everybody was talking about there was going to be a party. So I went and started talking people into staying, because I'm from Florida, Jacksonville, and we used to have these hurricane parties, and everybody would go to each other's house and drink and party and carry on, cook out. So I went by and picked up a lot of food, some booze, and I had some pills and stuff there. So I went and talked to everybody into staying. There was around 30 of us staying. And about 6 o'clock, everybody kept coming around and knocking on the doors, telling us to leave. And the manager and his wife said they had been in the a hurricane party, I think it was Betsy, and he'd just gotten as far as the 1st floor, about 8 feet high in the building. That building was one of the safest buildings because it was built real good, and we were going to have the party on the 3rd floor. I was on the 2nd floor.
The evacuation continued up to the last minute, but no one had predicted just how strong Camille would become. With winds gusting to 200 miles per hour, the sea began to swallow the Richelieu apartments.
Oh, I says, Fritz, I says, it's fixing to cave in any minute. I says, we've got to go. And so we ran back, and both of us stood with our backs to the door, and that water come through, it busted out the window and came through. And now we were on the 2nd floor, so you know how high it was. Then it came around to the back and busted in our bedroom window. And the bed started floating about halfway up, and he couldn't swim, so I blew up an air mattress like we had for the pool, and I told him to hang on to that. And I swam out, and well, right after I swam out, I got tangled up in the telephone lines, but the current was already off naturally by then. And then I heard him. It was so dark out there, and I heard him hollering, Marianne, Marianne, save me, and it had washed him out. And then, you know, I didn't hear anymore, so I guess he had drowned it. And so all I could think about was, like, you know, on ships and everything, when they go down, you know, so you see all the suction and everything. So I knew that building was fixing to go down because cracks had come all around the wall and everything. So I went and so I got loose and I started trying to swim. And I could see the lights up at where the hurricane party was, and the building just started all coming down in the water. And the river took me on, I mean, the water took me on, and they estimated it that the surge took me something like 12 miles altogether in and coming back out. I just kept praying the whole time for God to help me, and I kept saying that in the Psalm 23rd in the Bible. I kept, you know, reciting that the whole time I was in the water and just praying for him to please give me another chance at life.
Marianne Gerlach was the lone survivor of the hurricane party. The other 23 who stayed behind, including her husband Fritz, were found over the next few days among the wreckage. The Richelieu apartments, which looked like this, were completely flattened by the storm surge. Hurricane Camille left a legacy of dislocation and death, 15,000 homes, and the entire economy of the area destroyed. But Camille did not stop there. It caused devastating flash floods as far away as Virginia. In all, Camille killed 256 people and left almost $4 billion in damage. 20 years later, few reminders are left. Here, a crumbling foundation overrun by weeds. The old Richelieu apartments, a monument to the cost of staying. The scars left by Hurricane Camille have been covered over by time and new construction. And for most of the year, the Gulf is peaceful. In tropical waters, seasons pass with little change, the weather moderated by the warm sea. But in summer, when the sun shines directly down, the ocean begins to store up an enormous amount of heat, creating conditions necessary for hurricanes. Some of this heat is released by thunderstorms, which erupt when seawater evaporates and warm air begins to rise, condensing and producing clouds and rain. But most tropical thunderstorms die off quickly. It takes a rare set of events to produce a storm as violent as the hurricane.
We know from forecasting experience that certain things have to be true of the atmosphere to have a hurricane. There must not be very much wind shear in the atmosphere, which is to say that the wind speed itself cannot change very rapidly with height. The reason for this is if you try to form a hurricane in such an atmosphere, the hurricane literally gets sheared apart before it can really get going. And so hurricanes don't like atmospheres with a lot of shear in them. The water has to be warm enough because the warmth of the ocean water is the source of energy for hurricanes. And apparently the warm water has to be sufficiently deep in the ocean. It has to be about 200 feet deep. If the warm water is too shallow, if it's just in a thin layer at the top of the ocean, there's not enough energy there. And for various other reasons, you can't get a hurricane. But even when all of these so-called necessary conditions are met, you don't necessarily have a hurricane. You have to have something else come along to start it.
It takes what some scientists call a kick. In the Pacific, the trade winds collide near the equator, producing low-pressure zones and massive thunderstorms. In the Atlantic, similar disturbances occur over Africa. About 100 of these low-pressure waves move out over water each summer, but on average, only 6 become hurricanes. Air converging into the storm system begins to spin under the influence of the Earth's rotation. Hurricane forecasters look for this sustained circular pattern. As the storm intensifies, the inflowing air picks up speed, evaporating more and more moisture from the sea, transferring energy stored in the ocean to the atmosphere. The clouds grow explosively, forming a ring around the future eye of the storm. Then at high altitudes, the flow of air changes direction as the clouds are thrown outward.
The air that goes up in the eye wall, most of it flows out at the bottom of the stratosphere. And as we've said, the air has to flow out easily. That's the exhaust air. That's the waste of the hurricane. Some of the air that goes up in the eye wall actually turns into the eye and sinks in the center of the eye. And as it sinks, the increasing pressure causes it to warm. It's actually warmer than the air in the eye wall that's going up. It's what makes the sinking motion is what makes the eye clear.
Now a fully formed hurricane, the storm draws power from the warm sea below. As the wind picks up, thunderstorms form a tightening spiral. The eye begins to shrink and the pressure in the eye drops.
The eye wall is one of the strangest features in the atmosphere. It's as different from day-to-day weather as the atmosphere of Jupiter is. Very, very strange conditions. The very fast rotation rate, the very tight gradient of pressure, the low pressure at the surface.
Not yet a mature hurricane, on September 10, 1988, a storm system named Gilbert moves into the eastern Caribbean. On the 11th, it intensifies, becoming a hurricane, and it's headed straight for Jamaica. Late morning on the 12th, Gilbert hits Jamaica head-on. The National Hurricane Center rates the storm a Category 3 on a scale of 1 to 5, with winds over 110 miles an hour.
Here when we go to press, we're going to have it over the central part of the island, and it appears now as though it's going to go right down the backbone of the island.
At the Hurricane Center, the storm has drawn a flood of inquiries, along with a crush of local and national media.
I've never seen quite as much activity tonight as there is tonight.
Everyone wants to know the same thing. Where will the storm go next, and will it affect the United States?
The main bands are already beyond there now.
Forecasters Bob Sheets and Bob Case are at work studying the complex atmospheric puzzle that will answer these questions.
35 nautical miles from the eye.
How far we got our hurricane winds at now?
4 times a day, they update the official forecast, beginning with a look at computer predictions.
Every 6 hours by a satellite, or if we have an aircraft in there, every 6 or 3 hours, we get an observation as is shown here on the map. And what we do, we take the position, the initial position at time 0, and 12 and 24-hour positions earlier, and feed it into a computer. And we get the positions back on a copy, and then the tracks are plotted. As you can see, there are differences, and at times there are extreme differences, as much as almost 90 degrees difference, for one track will take off to the east and one would take off north.
These models are each based on different assumptions. One model, based on weather conditions on a larger scale, predicts that Gilbert will move toward a low-pressure zone expected over the southwestern United States, hitting land as far east as New Orleans. A second model, based on past storm tracks and Gilbert's current path, suggests the storm will stay south, held on a westerly course by a high-pressure zone over the southern United States. The Hurricane Center accepts this scenario, calling for Gilbert to continue west toward Texas or Mexico. But these 72-hour forecasts are seldom on target. The average error is over 300 miles.
Now, we have 72-hour positions, but the 48 and 72-hour positions are used mainly for the marine community. Actually, we feel as though because of the large error involved in the 72-hour forecast, it would probably be better for the general public not to receive this information, because all it does is create anxiety and frightens many people. And if they only realize the large errors involved in that 72-hour position, many times the hurricane's not even going to be there.
It is moving to the west at 17 miles per hour. Winds are now at 115 miles per hour.
Still, Gilbert clearly presents a threat to the Gulf Coast, even if no one knows exactly where.
There is the latest satellite photograph. The eye is very well defined. Of course, once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico, it'll be like a bull in a china shop, and we're going to have to keep a very close watch on that for you.
Bob Sheets tries to hold off any early panic by urging people to sit tight. Do not evacuate until the storm track is more certain.
All along so far, we predicted that it will go into the Gulf of Mexico within about 48 hours. Indeed, at that stage, the people over the Gulf should pay attention.
The first reports of Gilbert's impact on Jamaica are coming in. 500,000 homeless and many dead. Gilbert is potentially the most destructive hurricane in over a decade. Early evening on September 12th, as Gilbert moves off Jamaica, a hurricane warning is put up for the Yucatan Peninsula, western Cuba, and the Cayman Islands. The forecasters are worried that as the storm nears the Caymans, each communication could be the last.
Island should have nearly completed preparations for a major hurricane, for a dangerous hurricane, we got to motivate the people to take those actions. Okay.
How about for dangerous hurricane conditions?
For severe hurricane conditions.
In order to try and get this message to the Caymans, we have telephone contact, so we're going to telephone it down to the point down there, and we also have hams here in the office. We'll give it to them immediately, and hopefully we can get this information to the islands, to the Caymans.
They soon learn that phone lines to the Caymans have been cut off by the heavy weather, so the bulletin will have to be sent by ham radio. Gilbert is now a Category 4, with winds at least 130 miles an hour. Few hurricanes ever get this strong.
Do you have a contact in the Caymans?
Probably. I'll see what I can do.
We need you to get it because we have no other way of contacting them at this point through Jamaica. Jamaica can't contact them anymore.
Complete preparations for severe hurricane conditions.
This computer simulation shows what Gilbert looked like before it hit Jamaica. Its eye measured 25 miles across, typical of most hurricanes. But its violent mood was only beginning to emerge. Past Jamaica a day later, the eye has shrunk to 10 miles across, a sign that the storm has sharply intensified. Gilbert is now a Category 5, as strong as hurricanes get, with winds over 155 miles an hour. Heading right for the eye of the storm is NOAA's reconnaissance plane, now within 100 miles of its target. Its mission, pinpoint the exact center to help forecasters determine if it's moving straight ahead toward Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula or beginning to turn north toward Galveston or New Orleans. Probes and sensors mounted on the outside of the plane will record air pressure, humidity, temperature, and wind speeds, while radar shows wind and rain patterns. This information will be critical to predicting the height of the storm surge and assessing potential wind damage when Gilbert finally hits land. To get the most complete information, the plane normally flies into the storm at 5,000 feet above the sea surface, where the winds can be fierce.
Yeah, the only hard convection is right in the eye wall.
Yeah,
that's just like Allen was.
We're looking awful high that far away.
That's true, yeah.
But it looks a lot like Allen on the 8th.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. And it was a piece of cake at 5.
But Hugh Willoughby, lead scientist, and flight meteorologist Jeff Masters are concerned that today it might just be too dangerous. Should they chance 5,000 feet to get the best data or climb up to 10 for safety?
I don't know, if we're all strapped in and we're ready for it, don't have any altitude excursions, which I don't think we will.
If we go at 5,000 feet, we should miss that heavy cell there. Yeah, it might be big enough to orbit if we had to. We could climb to 10,000 feet orbiting in the eye if we did get a bad pass at 5,000.
Yeah. But like I say, Allen was just like that, and we spent the whole day at 5 with one good bump.
It should be a pussycat. Huh. Looks like the worst convection is on the northwest or the north side of the eye wall.
No plane has gone down in an Atlantic hurricane since 1955, but enough close calls have taught the crew to be cautious.
Sometimes it's not always pleasant, but it's always interesting. Almost always interesting. Nelson and I, the first storm we flew together, Edith, in a DC-6, and it just knocked us on our cans. It just upset us wildly, and we weren't at all sure what hit us. The airplane was physically upset. We hit some kind of extraordinary turbulence that just threw us temporarily out of control. And I wasn't sure it seemed like an eternity. I wasn't sure just which way was up and balanced flight. And Nelson and I thought maybe we were making a mistake in this whole thing. Maybe we were, but here we are.
David?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we're going to go in at 10,000 feet.
At 10, huh?
Yeah, we're playing it safe.
It looks impressive anyway. We have about 15 miles to the beginning of the wall here.
It's track 180.
Well, the eye is very small, almost too small to maneuver an airplane in. We can go straight across it, but we don't want to turn a lot inside the eye. It's only 8 miles across, and all around it are very intense thunderstorm updrafts. And you don't see many like this.
Moments from entering the eye wall, the pilot makes important last-minute corrections in order to hit the center of the storm.
Yeah, this will be our 18Z fix, so we want to steer until we find 0 winds.
So let's set condition 1.
Yeah, we got 100 knots of wind now.
Yeah, I thought it might drop off, but it hasn't.
Not yet.
If it hasn't by now, it probably won't.
No. We may see some 200 knot gusts here. 25 knot updraft.
Now in the eye wall, turbulence begins to rock the plane. Here are the hurricane's heaviest rains and strongest winds.
Let's keep tracking those winds.
Okay, we're just coming into the edge now.
The eye is as clear and as small as any this crew has seen. It is a narrow cylinder 12 miles high and perfectly clear all the way down to the sea.
Okay, do a right bank 20-degree roll angle, and let's hold it for about 10 seconds here.
The crew looks down on a raging sea and waves 50 feet high.
Jeez, look at that water out there.
By looking at the direction in which the wind is driving the waves, the crew searches for a point where the water is still, marking the exact center of the hurricane.
Do you guys see a center down below there?
I think we're just about directly over.
Oh, okay, I'll mark it.
Looks good, looks good. Think we got the center.
As the plane passes through the center, its instruments record air pressure readings lower than ever before measured from an aircraft in the Atlantic.
Hey, we had just set a new record for an aircraft surface pressure, 894 millibars.
These are extremely rare conditions. This is the sort of thing that you'd see in the 1935 Labor Day storm or in Hurricane Camille. You get destruction like a tornado over a swath 40 miles wide, perhaps. Very, very unusual over the tropical oceans.
On the south side, highest winds are 129 knots. On the north side, 167 knots.
Even as the airplane heads out the other side of the eye, wind and air pressure data arrive via satellite at the National Hurricane Center.
The only hurricanes that were of this class, we use a scale of 1 to 5, and this is a 5. The only hurricanes of this class were Hurricane Camille in 1969, Hurricane Allen in 1980 while it was over the water, not at the time it made landfall, and the 1935 hurricane that went into the Florida Keys.
The forecasters here pore over the numbers, fascinated by this astonishing display of nature's power.
About 40, it looks like. 40 miles wide. Outside of that, you've got 80 knots, maybe 100 miles per hour. That's the same kind of winds that are in the average tornado.
But they are also concerned that these figures, based on measurements taken at 10,000 feet, may not accurately reflect conditions at the sea surface. As the plane heads back for another penetration into the eye, the sense among crew members is that the storm is so strong, the readings have to be right.
They're questioning our pressure because we are extrapolating a surface pressure from 10,000 feet, from 2 miles high. So we're getting messages back. The Hurricane Center cannot believe that we are getting such a strong pressure in the eye, but we believe it.
Over the course of the day, the eye shrinks by over a mile in diameter, evidence of further intensification.
It's really smaller, if anything, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's down to 6 or 7 miles across.
That's pretty small.
As the eye shrinks, the air pressure continues to drop, and the lower the pressure, the stronger the storm.
Anything spectacular on the pressure that time?
Lowest I saw was 882.
Later on, readings in this range were confirmed by another NOAA plane and accepted as the all-time record low for the Atlantic.
Hurricanes don't stay like this very long. There are already indications that this storm, whether it hits the Yucatan Peninsula or not, will weaken in the next day or day and a half. What's happening is there's a ring of slightly stronger winds forming around the eye that we see on radar. And over the next day or so, this ring will contract and probably strangle the eye that we see now. Pressure may go down for the rest of this flight, or it may actually start up while we're here. But tonight or early tomorrow, the center will become much less organized, very probably.
The center does become less organized, but surprisingly, the storm does not weaken. Early the next morning, Gilbert hits the Yucatan Peninsula with winds of 170 miles an hour. It is the first Category 5 hurricane to hit land since Camille in 1969.
In a storm as intense as Gilbert, the effect of the environment is moved away from the center and towards the periphery of the storm. In this case, in this region surrounding the storm at about 100 miles out, as the plane was flying, we noticed an increase in the wind speed and the formation of a second ring, which within the next few hours evolved over the next 12 hours into another complete eye wall. That, again, once it formed, it started to act just like the interior portion of the storm and started to slowly contract inward. And this contraction continued even as the storm approached the Yucatan. And by the time the storm reached Cozumel, the aircraft noted that the intensity of the wind field in the outer eye wall was almost as intense as it was in the inner eye wall, where the inner eye wall is running about 180 miles per hour. Out in the periphery on this secondary eye wall, which is about 50 miles away, the winds are up to 120 miles per hour. So that Cozumel actually got a double shot. They got the first outer eye wall, and then they got the inner eye wall together.
But Gilbert weakens as it crosses the Yucatan. Cut off from its fuel supply, the ocean, its winds drop to 97 miles an hour, Category 2. But over the Gulf, it's sure to strengthen. Looking at the larger weather picture, the high-pressure zone is still driving Gilbert west, but over Texas, an expected low is developing. So the Hurricane Center calls for Gilbert to veer slightly north toward the low and probably hit Brownsville, Texas. But the turn could be sharper, so a watch, then a warning are put up for an 800-mile stretch from Mexico up to Louisiana.
It's over here in the monitor beside me, anywhere probably the northern part of Mexico through the Texas area. There's a lot of uncertainty in exactly where this hurricane's going to go 2 days from now, maybe even as late as 3 days from now if it were to recurve and perhaps go up in the Louisiana area.
Galveston.
To help define the uncertainty for the press and the public, the Hurricane Center issues landfall probabilities for locations throughout the Gulf.
Here's one more way of looking at the strike probabilities. Percent-wise, we think the highest probability still is for Brownsville and to the south, a little bit lower probability that it would come all the way up the coast and near Corpus, and the lowest probability here for Galveston. So it's possible that Gilbert could still come to the upper Texas coast. More probable, though, that the system will make landfall somewhere farther south.
Even with a fairly low chance of a direct hit, the city of Galveston prepares for the worst. One of its first actions, dismantling billboards that could turn into deadly flying debris.
we still have a serious storm in the Gulf of Mexico.
Even though Galveston is outside the warning area, officials are considering a full evacuation. Over the course of the day, they'll keep in touch with the Weather Service, which in turn works closely with the National Hurricane Center.
If the storm or hurricane continues at its present course, we could delay the decision to evacuate, and if it doesn't intensify, we could make the decision as late as 8 p.m. tonight.
We will not begin to relax until the storm goes inland. We hope it'll go in at Brownsville, and spare Galveston. We hope it stays at a Category 3 storm. But they don't pay me to hope. They pay me to be prepared and to protect lives. And you can't protect lives if you are playing Russian roulette. And we have 65,000 residents. We want them to be prepared to evacuate.
Almost half the island's residents have already left, so patrols are sent out to protect their property from looting.
Well, you know, Galvestonians are accustomed to hurricanes. We prepare for them. We know what to do for them. And, you know, Galveston had the largest natural disaster to hit the North American continent, which was the 1900 storm that really flattened this island. Years ago, it was touch and go and listen to the fishermen and listen to the old timers. And times are different and storms are different, and we prepare better. And that's why we don't have the loss of life that we used to have years ago.
Well, we're going to stick it out and wait for a while to see what the hurricane does. Hopefully, it'll move towards Mexico, and maybe the surf will get better here for us.
With the fringes of the storm hitting the Texas coast, up to 400,000 people have gone inland. Hundreds of businesses and factories have closed down, and the prices of futures on cotton, oil, and other commodities have started to rise. As the storm approaches land, aircraft become the eyes and ears of forecasters. Flying almost continuously through Gilbert's core, the crew will be the first to detect any subtle changes in direction and intensity. They drop a device called a windsonde, which records wind and pressure readings all the way down to the sea surface.
Okay, looks like we're coming up in the center here. Now let's drop in about 5 seconds.
Okay, ready to launch back here.
Okay, let it go.
Which way do you want to turn?
As it falls, the windsonde transmits information back to the plane for immediate relay to the Hurricane Center in Miami. Gilbert may not be as strong as it was in the Caribbean, but radar shows that the most damaging winds are spread over a much larger area than before. And as Gilbert is picked up by ground radar on the Texas coast, it continues to grow stronger and more dangerous. At 8 p.m. on the 15th, the Hurricane Center calls for the storm to move ashore just south of Brownsville in 24 hours. At the same time, officials in Galveston announced their decision, based in part on a different forecast that had Gilbert turning sharply north.
Ron, welcome to the effects of Gilbert here on Galveston Island. You know, it's real hard to believe that the eye of that storm is hundreds of miles away. We have 50 to 60 mile-an-hour winds right now. We have tides 4 to 5 feet above normal, if not higher. And we also have an evacuation order here. It came just a couple of hours ago.
It was the private company, AccuWeather, that predicted the turn toward Galveston. The forecast was later revised, but city officials never found out. Under intense pressure, they acted.
At 8 o'clock, we are recommending evacuation of the island. We feel that we cannot wait in the morning to make that decision.
Matthews didn't really want to do it tonight, but said he felt forced to play it safe.
I'd rather be criticized for overreacting than underreacting, and there's a loss of life.
Before dawn on the 16th, Gilbert Center is 150 miles offshore and moving toward land.
We are going to continue through the morning, going to low-lying areas, telling people of the need for them to evacuate, to move to secure shelter, and to get to one of the designated shelters as soon as possible.
In Brownsville, 350 miles south of Galveston, the city faces an even higher likelihood of being hit.
Getting the word out to people.
Downtown businesses have boarded up tight, and residents are moving to safe places.
Simon Rivera High School over on FM 802 and Vermilion Road. They just opened it. They have room for 200 people more. Okay?
With the city 20 miles inland, the problem here is not storm surge, but flooding from heavy rain. For those who may not realize the danger, police move in to warn them directly.
It's very possible this area is going to flood.
Ah, okay.
All righty.
All right, thank you for letting me know.
If you want a list of the shelters, there's a list here in case you change your mind and you want to call or whatever.
All right, thank you very much.
Buenos días. ¿Todo está yendo bien?
The efforts of officials to warn people have paid off. 75,000 people from Brownsville and 3 surrounding counties have come to public shelters. That afternoon, the mayor goes to the regional office of the National Weather Service. He sees on radar that the storm is about to hit land well to the south of Brownsville.
How long do you expect that we're going to have these kind of gusts and all the rain and everything? What are you all thinking?
At least till midnight.
We ought to get a press release out to Channel 4 and Channel 5 and the local radio stations telling them that, because we don't want them, the people...
But Gilbert is such a large storm that high winds still threaten the city. The mayor urges everybody to stay inside.
Right. And heavy rain, so that we want to keep people in the shelters and remain cautious until we're sure that the danger has passed.
But the danger does not pass quickly. The Weather Service has now issued a tornado watch, and the police rush off to confront a more immediate threat, a freak accident that could kill.
2 wires have apparently gotten loose and are touching together, causing a power surge of some sort up on the wires.
At 6 p.m. on September 16th, Gilbert finally hit land in northern Mexico across the Rio Grande River, 125 miles south of Brownsville. Texas was spared major loss of life. Still, there was an estimated $50 million in property damage caused mainly by tornadoes. Directly in the storm's path, in the mountain city of Monterrey in Mexico, torrential rains and flooding produced the single worst tragedy of the storm. 5 buses carrying evacuees overturned in the raging floodwaters. In all, 140 people in this town perished. Those places hardest hit will be a long time recovering. In Mexico, Gilbert left damage up to $2 billion. 60,000 homes destroyed, 202 dead. In Jamaica, Gilbert demolished homes, buildings, crops, roads, and power lines. The cost, $2 billion, 45 dead. In all, Gilbert killed 318 people and left billions in damage. It was one of the costliest hurricanes in history. For the forecasters, Gilbert was a moderate success. The storm did not make any unexpected moves, and the Hurricane Center was off by just 63 miles in its forecast 24 hours before landfall. But for residents of Galveston returning home and officials who called for the evacuation, Gilbert was a reminder of just how difficult it is to gauge the risk of a major hurricane.
Did we shut down the city? The city was basically shut down already. And given the same scenario, we would make the same decision again.
In the Galveston situation, you have to remember that there was a 10% or 12% probability that the eye of Hurricane Gilbert would come within 65 miles of Galveston during the next 24 to 36 hours. Now, let me turn that question around. If you were the official in charge and you had a 1 chance in 10 or a 1 chance in 9 that eye of Hurricane Gilbert was going to pass within 65 miles of your community, would you have acted?
In Florida, officials once again acted. Sunday morning, people were advised to evacuate. And by afternoon, more than 1 million had left their homes. During the night, Hurricane Andrew hit, with winds even more violent than expected. Fierce as it was, this time the storm did not pose any major problems for forecasters, tracking due west for 2 full days before making landfall. When daylight came, it brought with it the shock of unprecedented destruction, as storm photographer Emmett Williams recalls.
Well, we were all packed up and ready to go. We decided to take one last ride down US 1, one last look at Homestead. What a difference a day can make. I don't think anyone in the world had any idea that Andrew would reap this type of devastation.
And who would have guessed that less than a month later, another storm, Iniki, would devastate the Hawaiian island of Kauai, reminding us that despite our increased understanding, we are still vulnerable to the awesome power of the hurricane.
A production of WGBH Boston. Funding for NOVA is provided by
Merck, dedicated to pharmaceutical research, committed to discovery, improving health, extending life. Merck.
And Lockheed, America's aerospace company, supporting math, science, and engineering education for national technology leadership. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
This is PBS.